It's a lot. The world, the expectations, the pandemic, the constant changes, the unnecessary ignorance and rage, the world. Our mental health has been increasingly taking a beating, and that includes at work. So what's our relationship with it? Today we're talking about it to learn more and what we can do about it. Hold on. I'm Russel Lolacher, and you're listening to Relationships at Work, the Employee Experience and Workplace Culture podcast. Thank you so much. If you haven't had a chance to check out our Instagram account, please do. Go have it a follow. Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, I provide a little bit of my experience, knowledge, things that have popped out for me, things I'm feeling, things that might resonate with you, things that might make you think a little differently about the employee experience and the relationships you have with others. I'm really enjoying doing it, and I'm getting, a bit of great feedback about it. So hopefully you get a chance to go over to Instagram, follow Relationships at Work. It's the same name as the podcast, so nice and easy to remember. Today's episode I've been looking forward to do a while. When I was planning to do this podcast, it was very much about relationships with other people, but also relationships with ourselves. And mental health, wow. Well, in the workplace, mental health is such a thing that impacts both of those things, with others and with ourselves. I want to read you something on LinkedIn, and I'm curious what you think about this. Well, how it resonates with you or not. I'm just curious. It's been a week of feeling weak. High stress and anxiety for things outside of my control. It's impacted my sleep, my attention, my focus, my thoughts, my productivity, my emotions, my time with others. But I showed up how I could, when I could. It was just hard. I'm sure you've been there too. The best thing I did was acknowledge it, to recognize that I wasn't okay, that I wasn't myself, or able to give my full self in any situation. I sucked, it sucked, things sucked. Though it was far worse for others, recognizing and acknowledging the impact it had on me had value and a need. I'm taking some time, a breath, because I can and I need to. I hope you get the ability to do that when you're having a weak week. Where'd I find that? On my LinkedIn account, because I posted that just a few days ago. I've had a hard run of it recently, and I know many of us are having those kind of weeks where we feel weaker than our full selves, than how we like to show up. So I'm really glad you're joining me for this episode, because our guest today, she's an ambassador for it. She is so open. She is so relatable. You'll hear from her and you'll go, you know what? I've been there. I was listening to her and going, I wish I had your courage in a lot of those situations, because she's very open about how her mental health has not always been great and how it's gotten so bad it put her in the hospital. So again, thanks for joining us. Here we go. And on the show, we have Erin Hallett. And let's start by talking about why she's awesome. She's the Director of Alumni and External Engagement at Cambridge Judge Business School, but that is not why she's here. She is an advocate for better mental health at work. She's a well-being ambassador for Let's Improve Workplace Wellbeing, which is an HR community in the UK, which is actually where I'm going to be talking to her from right now. And she's a role model with Inside Out Leaderboard, which is a mental health action group that shares a list of senior leaders who are open about their experiences with mental illness, which Erin very much is. And she's frequently asked to write articles about said topic. So I'm thrilled to have her here. And I'm a bit of a nerd for Erin too, because we went to university together years and years ago. So I'm thrilled to reach out and get to talk to her again. Hello, Erin.
Thank you. It's a nice alumni connection, considering what I do for a living now. It works out really well, actually, doesn't it?
Nice of you, like connecting the linkages. Yeah. Nicely played. Well done.
Yeah, the alumni connection is strong. The network exists no matter where you are in the world, as I'm always.
What a way to sell external engagement. Just go, you know what? You could do in 20 years, you could do a podcast with somebody. Keep those connections alive.
That's right.
So for this episode, I was excited to talk about it because it's such an interesting realm, especially as it's morphed and changed around profile, I think is the biggest part of it with mental health. So I want to start by talking, when we talk about mental health at work, what are we even talking about when we talk about mental health at work?
That is such a good question, because I do think people get confused between mental health and mental illness. So the way I've started to think about it, and this is through, so many conversations with people over the years, is everyone has mental health. It's a continuum like your physical health. And some days you'll feel better, some days you'll feel worse. And some of us, unfortunately, will experience mental ill health much in the way some people experience diabetes or Alzheimer's or cancer or any other serious illness, like mental ill health. But mental health as a thing and how we think about it in terms of how we interact at work and personally is something we all have, and we all need to work towards having good mental health or positive mental health. And again, that's a continuum of whatever that means to you as an individual and within your wider community, especially at work. So I think that's one really important distinction.
So it is such a personalized thing, because what is good mental health for somebody is not great mental health for somebody else.
Exactly.
And bad mental health is a completely different animal. Are there, and I want to dig into that a little bit later about what that actually could look like or signs you could look for. But first, I want to get your perspective and your experience about how the perception of mental health in the workplace has changed. Certainly, it's not something, I mean, I'm not that old, you're not that old, but when we started our careers, we certainly weren't talking about mental health as a thing that was identified with, was talked about. How have you seen it change?
Well, I think the biggest change, it's obvious, I'm sick of talking about it, but let's be honest, COVID has been a great equalizer for everyone. So I think people who may not have mental illness have experienced varying degrees of mental health, good and bad, over the last 20-ish months, because, for some of us, being isolated has been a good thing, or some level of isolation has been a good thing. And for other of us, it's been a really, really tough go, depending on your circumstances. So I think that's one thing. I think what you touched on a bit earlier is, the profile of people speaking out about mental health is becoming, so much bigger. So seeing people like here, the big thing in the UK, of course, was Prince William, Prince Harry, our football or soccer stars coming out and talking about it. Seen a lot of celebrities, I think, in the US talking about it. I think Lady Gaga talked about it for a long time. I think it was in her documentary. So I think that's one thing. And I just think there are organizations and people looking at it from a more holistic point of view. So it's not being so pigeonholed into one thing, like you're either sick or you're well. It's becoming much more about what you eat, how you sleep, how you exercise, how you engage with, your personal and your professional lives. Like all of those things are starting to add up. So that lends to the conversation. And then I think, truthfully, one thing I've been so surprised about in the UK is that the charity, there's so many mental health charities, and what they add to that conversation, at the workplace is incredible. Like the resources they're pumping out, the free resources, is amazing. And truthfully, that's not something I really saw in Canada before I left 6 years ago. So I think that's playing a big role in how we talk about it at work. There's mental health. We have I think Bell in Canada has a time for talk day, right? In the UK, we have like a tea break day, and we're supposed to come together and talk about our mental health over tea. So they're trying to normalize it here, and I think that's really good.
There's a part of me, a little jaded part of me, that feels like a lot of organizations are realizing they can be more productive if their staff aren't, burned out. If they're actually treating their mental health well, their almighty dollar will still get to be generated better and better. But truthfully, I don't give a shit how the impetus for why it is, as long as we're treating people more like humans as opposed to digits of clocking in and clocking out, and pretending work-life balance is an actual thing, that life doesn't impact work, that work doesn't impact life. So regardless of what the impetus or the influence is and why it's changed over time, I'll take it. I'm good. I'll take it. So I'm glad you mentioned the pandemic. It's certainly done well from a awareness. Yeah, it's hard to say the pandemic has done
Yeah,
well.
I
It
was
even
gonna
said
say, no, but you're right.
it feels weird to say, but it is a major global event, is going to have, well, hopefully good and bad, in the
Exactly.
sense that, yes, of course, it's brought awareness, but it's also, brought people to their knees when it comes to stress and overwhelm and unknown. How have you seen it be so impactful? I mean, obviously, it's put a big spotlight for organizations to pay attention to mental health, but I mean, we still have to get out of this thing.
We still have to get out of it. And I think, I mean, this is perfect for what we're talking about, because I think one of the biggest impacts has been on your relationships. All those things that we took for granted, both at work and at home, aren't there necessarily in the same way anymore. And all the social cues and niceties, whatever you want to call it, that we relied upon aren't there. So, for me, one of the biggest changes was at work, I could walk into the office and sense the mood of my team or the organization, what was going on that day, right? I could look at them and be like, oh, you're sitting a little hunched over. You have bags under your eyes. Maybe you're not sleeping well. Maybe you didn't get your walk this morning, or whatever it is people love to do to help them. But suddenly, when we all change to this remote environment, because we're not supposed to say working from home, we're supposed to say working remotely, that went away. So I think organizations and managers, good managers, had to dig a lot deeper. So for me, right away, one of the things I recognized was it's not enough, and it should never be enough, just to ask somebody, how are you? You have to ask, how did you sleep last night? Are you are you getting out for an hour a day? What are you doing to take care of yourself? What can I do to help you? Because it's so easy to ask someone how they are and to brush that off. But if you don't dig deeper, especially in a workplace, you can miss so much, like tiny little bits of information that do contribute to that person's holistic health. But also, going back to what you just said, burnout is the worst case scenario. It's how in an organization we manage those ups and downs and make space for people to talk about them, bring them whole selves to work, and really understand that one blip doesn't crash their career or their professional reputation, and people will still respect them, and have faith in their abilities, because I think that is where a lot of the fear is coming from. And I think COVID really made that worse because people weren't seen anymore. And there's that presenteeism aspect as well, right? Like, we all have been in the office with people who are like just sitting there, like putting in their time, but they're not really there. We've all managed those people. We've all worked with those people. And that became even harder during COVID. People could just disappear.
Sometimes we are those people.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Sometimes we are those people.
It's almost in the virtual world too. It's sort of like there's just such a force for people to have their cameras on in this virtual world. And some people will like, oh, my camera's not working today. Truthfully, because they're just not ready to provide that extra layer of presence because they're dealing with their own shit. They've got a lot going on. I also find it funny, not funny, funny, interesting that managers, air quotes, supervisors, air quotes, are now being asked to be leaders. And they are just not ready. You're asking them to add this human element to this role they already had. It's not about the check marks of a manager or a supervisor going, you did your job, you didn't do your job. It's now, that is a person that you have to engage with and understand and empathize and be compassionate for, rather than just a producer of a project or a program or a thing. So I love that you're sort of like, we need better leaders, whether you're ready to be or not.
Yeah, but I think there's such a gap with that, because exactly what you said. When I started my career, often the people I was reporting into were people who, as you just said, were good at their job, could deliver X project on time, or may have been the most skilled in their class or whatever. But and I know this is such an overused term, but empathetic leadership, emotional intelligence those things were not in the picture. And I think we're at a critical point right now where we're hopefully starting to see that die out, and also the lack of tolerance for that. And I think one way you can start to see it is you're seeing a lot more employees speak up about bullying and harassment. And those are often from people who are really good at their execution of their job, but do not know how to be in a room, do not know how to lead, as you said, a team, and to, I mean, again, another term, situational leadership, to look at the individual and that situation and do what is best for them in that moment and not have a wide brush approach. For me, that is one of the most critical things. And I think where organizations are seriously falling down is they're promoting people without giving them the emotional intelligence, training, support they need to be good leaders. You can't expect someone necessarily, some people have it, some people don't, but you can't just throw somebody into that situation and say, okay, lead this team of 10, 5, 3, 30, and deal with all the complex things that are going on without giving them the support. And that support needs to start from the moment they're inducted into your organization. Here's what's available to you to learn how to lead with compassion, to develop your emotional intelligence. And if you don't, you will not be promoted, because those are not the leaders we want within their organization. And that is something I so want to see every organization adopt, because there cannot be this higher up hierarchical bullying culture from the top down that is so prevalent in so many big organizations. And I'm not speaking about my organization. I'm very lucky to work where I work, but I've seen it over the years. So
I love that you mentioned it in onboarding, because it so highlights that a culture is believing in it if it's one of the first things new employees get to see, as opposed to, oh, right, I'm the executive that has to put an email out this month. Oh, crap, let's put a bullet in there about mental health. Okay, moving on.
Yep, checkbox, right? It's not a
Exactly.
checkbox exercise. It has to be, I mean, really bottom up and top down. Like the role modeling piece, I think is really critical. You have to have leaders who are willing to speak out, whether it's about their own experience or willing to engage in an emotionally compassionate way with people. Not saying you have to have mental health challenges to be a good leader. That's ridiculous. But you do have to be able to have those conversations and be empathetic and flexible. Another overused word in leadership. But it is seriously, I mean, all joking aside, it is true. Those are things that make people want to work with you and, achieve things with you.
The world still isn't perfect, though, and there's still a lot of
Yeah.
stigmas that come around mental health. What are some of the biggest?
Well, I think for me, and I'm going to speak a little personally here, for me, the reason I hid it for so long was because I mean, let's be honest, I'm super A-type, I'm super career focused, and I did not want anyone to think I wasn't capable of doing whatever job I was in. So it's easier to push that side down of me. And that was at a pretty, that was midpoint in my career. So for someone coming up much lower, it's even more stressful. You don't want to show any weakness or anything that makes you look like you're not going to get promoted. You also, I think there's an outsider mentality around it too. You don't want to be an outsider, even though the statistics, at least in the UK, show 1 in 4 people will experience a mental health issue in the workplace. So, I work with 15 people, so that's like a third of them or even more, right? But I think it is really about being the person with the mental health issue and seeing how that impacts your career. Even in my current role, when I was filling out the employee forms a few months ago, I was like, oh, do I check that box? Like, do I check the mental health box? But ultimately, I did, because I want to be a good role model. But also, you need to give people the opportunity to help you. You need to give your organization, your managers, your leaders, your colleagues, everyone the opportunity to support you. And I think the flip side is that it's scary, but you need to give people a chance to prove they can be those people before you make a decision that they're not going to be. Right?
Fair.
It's not fair otherwise. Like, you need to be a little vulnerable. There's great strength in vulnerability. And I've been pleasantly surprised the last 6 or 7 years, like really surprised.
How so?
People have embraced this part of me that I tried so hard to keep hidden. I mean, I tried to keep it so hidden, I ended up in hospital. So But once I started talking about it and saying, actually, today's not a good day, fine, accommodations were made, still excellent at my job. I can still lead a team, but I'm doing it from a place of honesty, which is better for me, better for my organization, and better for my team, right?
And it's the relatability that allows other people to feel like they have permission to also not
Yeah.
have a great day and understand that work today is not their biggest priority, but they're still going to show up and they're still going to work and they're still going to do everything they need to do. But I might not be the most energetic and joyful person that I am usually today, if that is your type of personality. As a leader, I want to split this discussion into sort of two. Now that we've kind of started a good baseline, is the relationship people have with others at work, and also the relationship they have with themselves, and how they can, I don't know if mitigation is the right word. It might be more of approaches. So let's start first in the leadership realm, because we've already kind of shit all over how bad leaders can be. So
This
let's
is true.
try to be positive. Let's try to be
good leaders.
good.
There's so many good leaders. I've worked with so many great leaders.
Absolutely. So as a leader, a colleague, a human being, how can we show up at work to support others around mental health?
I think being open to a degree you're comfortable with about your life. It doesn't have to be about your mental health, but your personal life. It could be, oh, I wanted to go for a walk this morning and I didn't have the motivation to get out. That gives people permission to be a little more real. I think that's one thing we can do. Try to have those real moments of conversation. Like I said, it doesn't always have to be all about mental health, but there's just so many little things that we can do to create that culture of connection, I guess, at work that brings us all together. I think that's one of the things. I think if you are somebody who's comfortable, role modeling is the biggest thing you can do, and making sure people know where to go for help in your organization. And again, not in an intrusive, because everyone is so like private in this country compared to Canadians. And just my experience is like, it's been a little bit, I've had to tone back the Canadianness sometimes. But, making sure people know where to go for help, I think, is another thing that people, leaders, organizations can really do to help bring that out.
Is there anything, as being a good advocate for good mental health, what should you be listening for or trying to pay attention to when it comes to your team or colleagues around their mental health, and just sort of maybe I should be a little bit more receptive, empathetic today? Like, what should they be paying attention to?
I think it's hard. Like, I admit, like, it's been hard for me the last few months because I don't know this team very well, and I mostly know them online. So picking up their verbal and body language cues has been a lot more challenging. So I think it is about asking leading questions about, sometimes surprising people with leading questions, and then offering a bit like, oh, I had a terrible sleep last night. How did you sleep? Things like that. I do think, and I know it's different for everything, but I do think there are some tenements that support positive mental well-being, like sleep, exercise, even if it's fresh air for 10 minutes a day. Human interaction is another one. Not did you do XXX on your worksheet, but finding those spontaneous moments, which is really hard right now, to have a chat online where you just talk about, I don't know, what you watched on Netflix last night. I think that's another really good way. I think looking, you said something about cameras on or off. I think if you have a person on your team who's normally on and suddenly they're off, that's a good time to check. Non-responsiveness in terms of emails, and we use Teams here. Like, that's another thing I look for. Someone's usually really on it. Sometimes I send a WhatsApp message with like something I know they may like, just to, have a little like, so it's just it's almost like you're negotiating and having a dance in how you deal with it, especially now. Again, when you're in the office, it's so much easier. I think I'm not the only one, I'm sure, who's been in a situation where you've gone into the office and someone said, how are you doing? You burst into tears because you've just been like holding it in for so long. But that's so much easier to hide in this, you just turn off your camera and burst into tears and come back on. So I think there's those things you can do. And I think you have to make space for those conversations. And also you talked about, finding those HR putting the token whatever in an email. But I do think sometimes sharing those, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not activity days, but like taking a moment to say, oh, today is World Mental Health Day. Let's all take a pause and talk about something. So I know as a team last year at my former role, it was kindness was the theme for Mental Health Day, which was awesome during the middle of COVID. Like, how can we be kind? And what we did to mark that occasion as a team is we got together and we talked about kind things that had happened to us during COVID. So even taking a moment to reflect in the chaos can sometimes really be a good reset, because we're not necessarily talking about someone who's mentally ill. We're just talking about maintaining, a nice happy level where you want to be, so you don't get burnt out. It's not all like black and white, doom and gloom.
It's funny that you mentioned sort of that it's not always about mental health, but exactly it is always about mental health at the same time. Not to make it more confusing for some people. So what are some missteps you're aware of that people can have in the workplace culture where it could be exasperating people's mental health or ignoring it, dismissing it? What are some missteps you've seen or heard about?
Oh, that's such a good question right now. I think everyone is super sensitive generally right now, in terms of how we use language. And that also comes back to mental health. So I think one of the biggest things is saying things like, oh, you're acting crazy today, or so-and-so's acting crazy today, or that's a schizophrenic way to behave, or making jokes about not eating. There's so many things that even for me 10 years ago, I probably would have said like that. And now I think I really have to think. And again, that comes back to training and education, much in the same way we're talking about, other things that relate to equality and diversity and how we speak about gender and everything in that regard, right? We're all a lot more careful and educated right now. But similarly to the gender issue with mental health, I think there's nothing wrong with, and I think not so much as a misstep, but saying to somebody, I don't understand. Can you help me understand? So I think one of the best things you can do is like admit that if you're talking to somebody. And the other, I'm jumping everywhere, I'm so sorry. I'm super passionate about this subject. I think one of the biggest missteps, and this is like actually critical, is thinking you can fix someone's problem. You can't. You know too, Russell, that like if you're having a bad day, if someone says to you, oh, just walk it out, you're like, no, go away. That's not going to work for me. If I had so many people tell me to take a deep breath, I was like, I can barely like take a shallow breath right now, much less a deep breath. So I think one of the best things you should not do is try to fix it for that person. Being with that person, with their situation, and just physically being there, emotionally being there is the best thing you can do. Not being like, oh, have you tried this? Or my experience is this. Recognizing that it's different for everybody. And sometimes not saying anything is the best thing at all. Like sometimes just even sitting in silence on a Zoom call while somebody has their moment is one of the most powerful things you can do. It's the equivalent of, sitting with your good friend in a coffee shop and not saying a word, because they just need that human connection.
Where does privacy come into all this?
What do you mean privacy?
Well, some
I'm
people...
Canadian. Come on.
No, privacy. What's privacy? I mean, people are very private about what they're going through, or there is some organizations have some privacy legislation and so forth about what's revealed and what's not revealed about individuals. So if someone's choosing to be quite private about their experience, how do you approach that?
Well, you honor it. I think the best thing is, like for me, yeah, it works for me to be super open. I'm not worried what people think. To be perfectly honest, I don't care if an organization doesn't want to hire me because I talk about this, because I'm only going to work places that like love all this about me and are happy for me to do things like talk to you and support that. But I've been working for over 20 years. I'm really comfortable. I've had a lot of therapy. Someone who's in their early 20s and starting out, they might just need somebody to talk to And the best thing you can do is keep their confidence and, make small adjustments that aren't obvious to the rest of the world, but also let that person, that colleague, whatever you want to call them. I hate calling them colleagues because it seems to me a bit dehumanizing, but let that person know you're on their side and they can come to you with anything. I think what really surprised me when I started to talk about my experience is how many people started doing that. It was humbling. It was really incredible, but it was also really sad because there were so many people I ended up running into that had never been able to talk to anyone before at work. Like they may have talked to their spouse or their partner, or whoever, their family, but being able to share that burden privately with somebody you work with, that's huge. To feel like you've got someone on your side at work, even if you're not public about it, it's still a win. And that confidence and that openness, even though it's private, it translates into the culture wider. Like that person becomes a better teammate. They're happier at work. There's less presenteeism. There's, they're more engaged, loyalty, all those wonderful things start to happen. Like the psychological safety, maybe it's not being talked about. Like everyone doesn't have to sit in a circle and wave their feelings around with a piece of sage, but knowing they have that psychological safety empowers them. And I think that's so important.
So the last question I want to ask about the colleague coworker side of things is, say I'm someone who is not comfortable. I am still I'm a learning leader. I am a manager supervisor where it has always been about check boxes. But now I understand that this is important. I understand that I should be there with mental health with my team. But I don't have that relationship with them yet, nor have I exhibited behavior that I ever gave a shit before. So now but I want to do better. So what are the first sort of steps I can take to champion a healthier mental health environment?
So I think training is a great thing. Just much in the same way we've had to do unconscious bias training, had to do training about terrorism. So all these things that are suddenly coming into the cultural space and becoming norms, we're doing training. So I think managers at any level should have to do some training about mental health, whether that's resources, how to have difficult conversations in that context. If someone comes to them with something really serious, like in terms of, talking about suicide, where to signpost that person and when that line of confidentiality gets out the door, right? Like those are important. I think there's other subtle things managers can do, like sharing a little more about their own lives. Again, not necessarily from the mental health perspective, but just being generally more open. I think LinkedIn, as you and I both know, is a powerful tool for leaders to engage with people who are talking about those subjects, talking about mental health at work, sharing those posts, saying, yes, I believe in this leadership style. I think those are all things leaders can do to help raise their profile in that space. And I know that sounds a bit political, but I do think it comes back to role modeling and just being, a leader who is intelligent and empathetic and there for their team.
All the things you want in a leader.
It is all the things you want in a leader, and not starting every meeting with, okay, what did you do today? Like being like, hey, did you watch the latest episode of Cheer? Because it was amazing, like so good. Are you watching the Sex and the City reboot? It's horrible. But, having those conversations, like those conversations are important, and everyone feels like they don't have enough time, but that's just not good enough right now. No one is above giving somebody 1 minute, 5 minutes, 30 minutes, especially leaders. That's why you lead. You lead to create this incredible team that feels safe and wants to be loyal and, wants to come to work. And like work-life balance, yeah, I agree with you. It's like, whatever, some days you have it, some days you don't. But that's the team you want, right? And that's the leader you want to be for that team.
Nobody is too important that they can't offer time.
Exactly.
I don't care where you are in the hierarchy, but yeah, you absolutely need to.
Time, and also time for yourself. The flip side of that is, as a good leader, you have to find those moments for yourself. Like I always say to my team, you know what? yeah, I do yoga if I'm home at lunch. I am worth 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and asking them to think about it from that perspective. You are always worth that time. And that person is always worth that time. But it has to be a two-way relationship, both for yourself and for people you're dealing with.
Perfect transition into the relationship with yourself and
Oh,
how you can prioritize mental health for yourself. How do you do that? Is it about carving out time for movement? What are some ways we can prioritize that for ourselves?
well, I think it's about really realizing it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. What works for you one day isn't going to work the next day. Some days you may want to go for a walk, other days you may want to stay in bed. And I think there is, and I wrote about this a bit this week, I think there's so much external pressure from things like Dry January or Blue Monday or Strava or God knows what else is there. Like, don't eat this, don't drink this, walk this much, run this much. And I think it does create a lot of, like, it's kind of passive aggressive, I feel. Like it gets you down, because if you don't do it, you're like, oh, I'm a terrible person and my physical and mental health are going to go to shit, right? Like, and that's absolutely not true. I think what's important as an individual is to find things that you genuinely enjoy and you aren't doing for the sake of, and that can be, knitting. Like, who cares what it is? And it might be knitting for 6 months. And then you might be like, actually, I do want to run a marathon. Good for you. But it's not the same for everyone. And I think recognizing that within yourself and recognizing that in other people is really important, and not trying to push stuff on other people. And then the biggest lesson I learned during COVID was I am really worth that 5 or 10 minutes. So even if I am so stressed out, if I'm working and my shoulders are like up around my ears and I'm like sweating out of every, pore of my body, actually, I'm worth 10 minutes of doing whatever it is that makes me happy, And I have to start prioritizing that, because otherwise I start to spiral. And then things like sleep and diets. And again, diets, I don't really like to talk about that much, because I don't believe in diet. I believe, eat what makes you feel good, treat yourself when you want. Life is too damn short to, not treat yourself with kindness. And finally, and this is something I heard in therapy a couple of years ago, and it's really, really stayed with me, because at the time I was talking to myself like quite cruelly. Like, I was treating myself like crap all the time, and I was saying really mean stuff in my head. And the person I was working with said, you would never talk this way to somebody you work with. You would never talk this way to your best friend, to your family. So talk that way to yourself. Treat yourself with that same respect and kindness. And even telling you this right now, I'm getting shivers, because it stuck with me, and I don't always remember it. But wow, when I do, that is powerful. Like, that is some of the best advice I've ever happened. I would never talk to almost anyone the way I was talking to myself back then. I would never judge them or, punish them essentially for things they had done or hadn't, or didn't do.
So you mentioned earlier that I don't want to go into the specific story, but I do want to highlight what happens if you don't prioritize mental health for yourself.
Yeah.
You ended up in the hospital because you were, as you said, spiraling to a point where it got so bad. What I don't think people realize is the bad mental health and ignoring your mental health can show up physically and emotionally in how your body reacts to that. How do you explain how bad it can get to other people if you don't prioritize this stuff?
I'm going to date myself quite badly here. So I remember, I don't know how many other people remember, but there was a thing many, many years ago where Tom Cruise jumped around on Oprah's couch. Do you remember this?
Yes.
And he was like,
I'm only 27 and I remember.
Oh yeah, well, I'm only 22 and I remember. It's amazing.
Amazing
remember
memory.
In the womb. It's amazing. And he was like, mental health, you just think your way out of it. And at the time I was like, damn, Tom Cruise, you were right. No one has an excuse to feel that poorly. And then when I got to the point where my brain was telling me stuff like, hey, you're not paying attention to me, you're really tired, you're not eating well, you're working too hard, you're not asking for help. And my body expressed it, and which is actually really common. It felt like I was having a heart attack. I couldn't breathe. You hear this quite regularly. People have panic attacks. So that's how I ended up in hospital and going through all the testing to prove I didn't have a heart attack. And yes, you have a very bad anxiety. Okay, obviously that's what it was. But for me, it's very hard to intellectually understand that until you experience it. Like I never would have believed, like I was fully convinced I am having a heart attack. There's no way my brain and my body can be so misaligned that my brain is like, hey, let's pretend you're having a heart attack. And while you're at it, like, let's have stomach upset. Let's, throw up on the street. Like, let's do all these crazy things. Let's have a headache for weeks. No way, that's physical. I'm dying of something physical. Give me a physical diagnosis, because that would have been easier emotionally initially to handle, because weak people can't manage their mental health. And I didn't want to be weak. I wanted to be like Tom Cruise jumping on the couch. I always say to people, it's kind of like when people are like, oh, my back is so sore, I can't move. And you're like, come on, just suck it up, get off the couch, or, go walk it off. Until you experience yourself, it's very hard to understand. For me, it's always like every time it happens, because it still happens in varying degrees sometimes, I'm like, damn, I've stopped paying attention. This is my body giving me the warning sign. It's wild. It's a wild ride when it happens. And it never fails to surprise me or make me so humble. It's the most humbling experience.
If someone's listening to this right now and they want to know, okay, what are 2 things I can do right now to prioritize my own mental health? What would you suggest to them?
Make time for yourself in a way that is meaningful for you. And I'm not talking weeks or days. I'm making that a habit of 2 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever you can fit. Everyone is busy. A lot of people have so many commitments that are beyond my wildest dreams. But finding those moments, really important. And then I know what I said about breath earlier, but I do believe sometimes taking a 5-second breath is one of the most beneficial resetting things you can do. And I'm going to be cheeky and add a third one. Find your person. Find a person that you can be your whole self with, whether that's at work, in your personal life, just someone. Find a person. You need to be able to be your whole self with at least one person, because it's when you keep things inside that it gets hard. The noise gets too much. That's been my experience.
The question I was going to ask next, I think, has been answered in our conversation, which is, what's the number one thing you shouldn't do in regards to your mental health? And from listening to you, Erin, it's ignoring it.
Yeah,
that has to be the worst thing you can do, is pretending that mental health is not only not important, but also that we don't all have to deal with it or address it or look at it or examine it, but because it is there for everyone, whether you want to admit it to yourself or not.
Yeah, I agree. I think ignoring is one of the worst things you can do. But also the other thing I think it's really important is not thinking it's weakness. It's no different than having a headache, catching a cold, breaking your leg. It's really just, we treat all those things. We give so much compassion generally to people who are dealing with physical illnesses. And we need to extend that same compassion to ourselves and to others who are dealing with mental health challenges, whether it is like a serious illness, like a diagnosed illness, or just even a bad day. There's nothing wrong with having a bad day. There's nothing wrong with having a little bit of a headache. It's fine, but we be compassionate.
I want to end it with the 2 questions I always want to ask each of my guests. So the first question is, it's either best or worst, your decision on which story you want to tell, but what is the best or worst employee experience you've ever had?
I'm going to relate it back to mental health, since that's what we're talking about.
Of course.
Obviously. So I might get choked up talking about this, but when I was in the hospital after I had my panic attack at my former work, and I was in the hospital waiting to be discharged, and I had to message my then team. And I made the decision in that moment to say, actually, I'm not physically sick. I'm struggling with my mental health. I need to take a 24-hour reset. I need to, I just need some space to feel well again. And I hadn't worked with this team for very long. And one of them, who I'm still very close with now, messaged me back and she said, well, how about I come and bring you a toothbrush? And that was such like the perfect minute moment of kindness that I needed right then, to feel like someone understood, that they respected what was going on, and that they still valued my place in the team as their colleague and as their leader. It just normalized everything in that moment. And I'll never, ever forget that as long as I live. Like, I think it was one of the most wonderful things that happened to me in my career.
I love that. Absolutely love that story. And the last question, Erin, what's one simple action that people can do right now to improve relationships at work?
Bring your whole self to work.
Love it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erin Hallett, for being on the podcast.